we're happy to finally get this series started again this school year. I'm sure some of you have been wondering why we've been so slow to get going, and I'll share more details in a little while when I give a whole project update, but it's all good news. We're very busy moving ahead on our project outcomes, which means this year we're going to do less, not as many, this school year, I mean, we're going to do not as many frequent community conversations, so we can have extra time to work on our other projects that we need to really move ahead on this school year.
My name is Amy Tobias. I'm the project manager with Bilingual Montessori, and I'm just going to share with you, for those of you that haven't been to a community conversation with us before, I will share with you a little summary about our project. The project came out of a discussion and struggles that our founding partners kept hearing about how to best integrate bilingual education into Montessori schools effectively. And the next photo is from the Lead Montessori Conference open space session in Prague in 2019. This was one of those discussions that we all felt the struggle and what we feel is the origin of bilingual Montessori. Afterwards, we had conversations about it and applied for and received a 3-year grant to support our project. And we launched Bilingual Montessori in February of 2022. So our approach to this challenge that we have comes from the whole school perspective as we work with the specific needs of the different groupings that make up a school, namely the Montessori guides, the language specialists, and the school leaders. Keeping those groupings in mind, we are developing the grant outcomes in 3 different areas. First, we're creating a design process field guide that will share effective classroom and administrative practices for Montessori schools and second language acquisition, information for supporting the goal of bilingual education. Secondly, we will be offering a 3-level online training course based on this field guide for those of you wanting to build or improve a bilingual school with our support. And third, we're creating a community for all of us to engage in, to practice and support each other through different activities such as this community conversation and our social media groups and on our bilingualmontessori.com website. And the next slide shows our team. Many of you have had a chance to meet all of us during the previous community conversations. So each one of you is part of our journey. So we really appreciate it when you keep in touch with us via our website. You can send us our email. We send out newsletters and through social media. And always we would welcome your feedback and would like to know your needs for the project. This is taking a big community to work together, and we would love to hear from you. So now I will pass it over to Mary Kay, who will share with you more about the future of our project today.
So like I just began saying, next year, 2024, is in the scheme of our 3-year grant is when we really, our deadlines for delivering our big project outcomes. And one is this design process field guide that we refer to quite a bit. And this is going to be an online digital resource. It's not going to be a recipe book, but it's meant to give you resources and ideas. We're collecting information from schools all over the world and explaining and sharing with you different practices that have worked for different schools. And also explaining the context where that school is located. And so then you can get inspiration. Either you see like, oh, yes, that might work for us in my school, or no, our situation is completely different. And that's really, in my opinion, and the key to creating programs with more than one language, is that you have to be very aware of the context of where your school is located, in terms of the profile of the families, the profile of the schools that the children are likely to continue studying when they leave your school. All of these factors make a big difference in choosing what your priorities will be. And then once you have your priorities and objectives, in selecting the strategies that you need in the classroom, and also administratively to make your objectives a reality. So we have the field guide, and then we're also developing an online course, which is essentially will be a complement to the field guide. It will have obviously many of the same themes. You'll have different lectures that you can listen to offline, exercises that you can do. And again, in line with the approach of the project, we're taking a whole school approach. So it will be geared towards school leaders, administrators, to classroom guides, and in addition to language specialists that work in schools. So we want to also help these different professional groups communicate with each other and understand the challenges that each one is facing, in the hopes that that will make things run more smoothly in a given school. So really working on these two big parts of our grant work is what we're doing this year. And we're still going to keep the community conversations going because we think they're really valuable and we learn a lot from them. I mean, a lot of information we get from the community conversations go into our field guide. So the upcoming ones, the next one will be Laura Cassidy, who is an upper elementary guide who spoke last year about different, how to create a culture of language learning in your environment. And this year in a few weeks, she's going to speak more in detail about how she works with supporting developing writing skills with her. She works with upper elementary students. Following her, we will have Licia Arnaboldi from Como, Italy, who is an English, she was for many years the English language coordinator in her school. And in that role, and given the situation in Italy where they don't have a full bilingual program, the students have a certain limited number of hours of English lessons per week. And so she and her colleagues became very creative in finding other ways to expose the children to English and reinforce English. And so she is going to speak about some of those innovations, which I think you'll find inspirational. After that, we have Denise Fernandez, who is a children's house guide in Córdoba, Spain. And Denise has developed a lot of her own very original strategies in how to support children with acquiring a second language and also starting to develop literacy skills in the second language. After that, we have Roberta Andena, also from Italy. And Roberta is going to share with us her school's experience with external exams. Because in her school, they offer the Cambridge exam, and they also offer, well, they also are required to do an Italian national exam. And so she, with her colleagues, has worked very hard to integrate those exams into their school culture, their Montessori school culture. And so I think it will be very interesting for schools that may be considering or maybe have the same obligation to do a national exam, and how to make it aligned in the best way possible with our Montessori philosophy. And then we'll be announcing more talks for the rest of the school year. The countries that have the most answers have the bigger size font. So we have Mexico, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, seem to be the most common countries. Also with people from Switzerland, Scotland, Latvia, Canada, Japan, Colombia, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Yeah, amazing. I mean, we always have very international audiences, and this one is definitely in line with that. I think we'll get started now, and I will introduce you to today's speaker, who some of you probably already know. Ana Camila Jiménez Borbolla is an AMI 6 to 12 trainer. She worked as a guide in Cuernavaca, Mexico for 15 years in the classroom. And then she began her Trainer of Trainers program, and she's been working as a trainer now for 7 years. I've known Ana Camila for many years. I had the pleasure even of being able to go observe her in her environment before she was leaving. It was a week where I was able to learn an immense amount from watching a pro at work. So we've always remained in touch, and I became aware that she had initiated within AMI trainers a working group, a committee to look at multilingualism. And of course, given my own interests, I wanted to check in with her and find out what they were doing, what their goals were. And she, she's going to share all of that with you now. I don't want to give it away, but I'll just say as a way of introduction as well that Ana Camila herself is bilingual. She grew up learning English, but has explained that it wasn't until she was an adult that she really integrated in English into herself and became truly bilingual. And now she has her own 2 daughters who are also being raised with more than one language. So Ana Camila, before we get to the main topic of today's talk, which is you to explain what your working group is doing and what your goals are and what work you've done already, I thought it might be interesting if you could just share with everyone your own experience when you were in your environment in Mexico, where you also had the presence of English as a second language, and how it was organized there, where Spanish was the first language, the academic language, and how in that school you organized having the presence of English as an additional language.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Nice to see everyone. So for, I guess, all the years I was in the classroom, I always worked with a bilingual assistant. So I don't have another experience other than that. I first worked 9 years or so in the lower elementary, and then I transitioned to the upper elementary. And you do see, you see different things in both subplanes. So how it worked was like the Spanish teacher could be bilingual or not. That wasn't something required. You just had to speak Spanish. You had to be certified as an AMI teacher. And then your bilingual assistant had to have certain requirements for, I guess, it didn't have, like, it could be a native speaker that maybe didn't know how to give English as a second language, or it could be a non-native that had studied to really give that second language. So depending on also who was available, because what happens is that if you have native speaking English persons, then they wouldn't be, or they wouldn't spend so many years at school because maybe they would leave. So then the school had to choose whether you would have that permanent person for more years, even though the English wasn't as beautiful and fluent, or so it just fluctuated in the 15 years I was at school. So it had to do with what you also have, like the human resources you have where you live. That was also something to consider. So that person was at the very beginning of the project, that person was only to give the language aspect, so English. But then with time, children started to ask for more, as we know. And so as those bilingual assistants would be permanent at school, they would be more interested in whatever we did with the children in the other areas. And so it became more organic, as in they fluctuated from English to Spanish in different areas. Their work journals could be in Spanish or in English, their personal dictionaries with words in English and Spanish. So the language really became much more integrated into the everyday life. Obviously, you would have practical life in children's house, infant community, like going out were happening in English. But as the project developed, you could see more of that.
Right. No, and I think that is, I mean, the way you described it, obviously, first of all, you're always limited by who is available, who's living where you're living, who has also the right human characteristics of people that you want to be working in your school with you. And then from there, you kind of also follow the children and what they're asking for. And I know that when I was observing you in your environment, you know, the English assistant was very well established in that environment. And it was really nice to see that she had her own relationship with the children and the way that with that integrated English into what they were doing, although it was very clear the whole time that Spanish was the main language of instruction and the work that they were doing. So I really appreciated the balance between the two. The English was present and integrated, but there wasn't a sense of competition, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That each language had its place and it worked quite well. So
I think one thing that's important to mention is that the school never advertised as a bilingual school.
Right.
Because it wasn't a bilingual school.
Right.
In the strict sense. It just had the exposure to English in a more organic way. It was just there all the time. And what I could tell you is that children were not aware of the language acquisition. So if I would ask them, like, do you know English? They would say no. Because they're just listening and speaking, but they're not really aware of how much they knew. It was when we did a going out to New York, and when they came back, they were telling their parents, like, I could move there. I can do it by myself. Like, I could ask for things, I could do this, I could do that, but they weren't aware.
Yeah.
Till they were exposed to certain kinds of situations where they just had to bring out everything that they had inside, which they sometimes didn't know. So that was very interesting to observe.
Yeah, and I'm kind of laughing because that's a big going out.
Yes, it was a great, they called it the great going out. That's how it was labeled,
Yeah.
the great going out. And
Yeah.
it came about because they wanted to use English.
Okay.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, they were asking.
Yeah, they were asking that.
Mhm.
So,
That's So thank you for just giving an overview of how the work was done in Mexico. And now we can shift to our main topic, which is the working group, which you got started within AMI. So if you can just give us the overview and let us know kind of what work you've done. Well, first, who's in the group, what your goals are, the work you've done, what's left to do. That would be wonderful.
So the committee started because there were many of us trainers within AMI that are very interested in, it was at the beginning something regarding bilingualism. Because it not only happens that many of us worked in a bilingual classroom, but also in our courses, we have many languages going on when we train.
Mm-hmm.
And many of those people who are in training also want to know what will they do when they go to their bilingual classrooms or their multilingual classrooms. So it also has that perspective within training. So as you say, you just start speaking to one another and suddenly this committee comes to life. And we are 14 trainers, volunteers. We're volunteering our time and our passion. And there's trainers from 0 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 18. So we have the whole scope within the committee, which is very, very nice because you can hear the whole approach of the spectrum, like the continuum of development within all the courses we do give in AMI. So that's how it started. We've been working on and off because we're volunteering our time and we don't always have a lot of time. So what we've been doing is having targeted conversations about certain things. And the first conversation we had was, why would it be bilingual if we are really a global organization where what we really see is multilingualism? And so we shifted from an English and perspective to a multilingual perspective, because that is what we really see in the classrooms that sometimes we consult or that our students are teaching at. And so that was the first great shift, I would say, that happened within the committee. And then it's just, the conversations are just developing regarding what are the best practices. For example, are we only talking about multilingualism, but we're also talking about multiculturalism? So how do we deal with that when you're really having a lot of cultures and a lot of languages within one classroom? So I can say that those conversations have been very, very rich, and that slowly they're leading us to the goal of our committee, that is going to be a document that can help either trainers, leaders, school leaders, teachers, anybody within Montessori that want to establish a program, be it bilingual or more multilingual, where it can give you the starting point of what is it that you want for your program. So I think that's the question we always need to ask ourselves when when we are thinking of a project or a multilingual project or a bilingual project. And you mentioned that, Mary Kay, and that has to do with the context. Where is the school established? Who are the children attending school? What are the parents' perspective about education? What are the means that the school needs to have in order to be able to establish a program? How can you make a classroom function when you have so many languages going on? And I can talk to you about that, in a moment, because that's what's happening right now with my two daughters. So this committee is focusing basically on how to maintain a child-centered approach when we're dealing with multilingualism. So it has to be an approach that is respectful to the development of the child. That is our first goal as a committee. And for that, we really need to emphasize on certain aspects that are important. For example, how will the preparative environment look like? Well, that will depend on the goals you want to establish as a school. If what's happening is only language in the oral aspect, that could be one goal, and then the prepared environment would look a certain way with very specific things happening. But if you're shifting to be it oral but also written, that would shift how you would prepare the environment. And then if you have the oral and the written language, then you will have different levels and what's the goal of your school or your environment. And then the environment would look different or would have to be prepared in a different way. But within all the planes of development, there are certain aspects of the prepared environment that need to be kept in order for it to be a respectful way for the child to develop. 1 language, 2 languages, 3 languages, how many languages you want. So that would be one very important aspect of the document. The next would be the prepared adult. So again, going back to the different goals, what kind of prepared adult are we looking at? And I think you've mentioned if you're going to have a bilingual assistant or a second teacher, a Montessori teacher in the classroom, and how would that look? If you're aiming for a specialist, what kind of training does the specialist need, etc. So that has to do with the prepared adult. But also within the prepared adult, you also need to talk about how can you be respectful with a child, depending their developmental age, regarding other languages. Like, can we really approach a child in a certain way and say, I don't understand what you're saying? For example, when you do understand. Or can we just not understand a 2-year-old when they're speaking their native language and we're simply not understanding? Does that meet what the child needs, or is meeting the requirements of a certain program? So the prepared adult also needs to be in tone with the stage of development, the prepared environment, to be able to talk with the other adults. Because that's also something that happens when you have another adult and that adult has responsibilities, for example, giving part of a curriculum or a language, that becomes an adult that needs to have a very specific communication or type of communication with the other adult, because it not only has to do with the daily life of the classroom, which is so important, but it also has to do with content. or with following a child. So observation is keen. So that adult would also need to be very keen on observation. So there are certain things when you're talking about the development of a language in the classroom that those adults need to have. So that's another aspect of the document. Then we also have what are the specific, like what also with the prepared adult, what is true for all the planes of development. So then we have that, and then we will have what's specific to each plane and subplane of development, because within the subplanes, there are important things to mention. Then we'll have a part where we will talk about questions and answers. So what are the questions that we get frequently from either trainees, from school leaders, from teachers around the world? So we'll have a section on that could help people, when people read the document, it will help them. But also we'll have like a part where we will talk about resources. So if you want to go into further detail or learn more about language acquisition, then you'll have a very good resources. So that's more or less how the document is going to be at the end. But obviously when you're developing something, it will not always come out as you planned, because other things come up and the conversations keep going. So, well, we'll see at the end what will be the end of it. But more or less, that's how it's coming up. So I think the important part of it is that schools need to ask questions about what is it that they want to do, or what is it that they already have, and how can they make the best practices out of what they have. So best practices will be another part of the document. What are the best practices in general when you're talking about multilingualism in Montessori? And then what are best practices within each plane or subplane of development? And that has to do with the characteristics of each subplane of development. So what I see, for example, in the elementary is that if the child is not interested in language acquisition, if they don't see a purpose in acquiring that language, it's very hard. It's very hard just to get that language going. If they see a purpose, then they will be engaged, they will want more, and they will research by themselves, and they will get going. That doesn't happen as much in the 3 to 6, because in the 3 to 6, they're already keen on language, keen on words, they are repeating, they are verbalizing, they remember the words. So that's an important aspect that you don't have in the 6 to 12. The memory aspect is harder. They forget the words that they just practiced because sometimes they're not using it as much. Or sometimes they get so many new words because other classmates are speaking so many new words that they have trouble keeping up. So when you look at those details within the subplanes, then you can get a better sense of what those best practices are or could look like, depending on obviously the scope or the goal of your project or your program. So that's going to be another section of our document. When I was saying before, like you need to ask the right questions, is because sometimes you want to start a project and you haven't asked those questions. So what is it that you want? What are the children in your classrooms? How can you make those languages or that language visible to the children? Are they going to be able to practice it? Is it artificial or is it there? How many, like, what's the percentage of children speaking the different languages? Is the language required by the government? In what way? And with all those questions going on, then I hope that this document can help people that need to decide or make decisions about how that program will look like. It will help them design the program the best way that will help the children in each subplane or plane of development. So that's basically what we want to do, what we're doing.
And when the document is completed, I assume you'll make it available on the AMI website?
Yes.
Right.
Once we finalize the document, AMI will edit and do all the beautifying aspects of it. And then they will do the communication and all of it.
And I know that it's hard to say because, as you mentioned, you're all doing this in your free time, which don't tend to have a lot of, but what is your sense of how much longer your part of the work will take? Is it a year, 2 years?
I hope that we can finish by 2024, probably maybe by the end of the school year. If we take longer, then by the end of 2024.
Okay, all right.
It will depend. It will depend.
Okay. And how do you, not just you, but the whole group, how do you envision this document being used? Is it, I mean,
I think the document will produce more questions than answers. And I think that's what we want to provoke.
right.
We want to provoke people thinking about the different projects or the different contexts, but always putting the child in the center. So it will be a document that will make you ask those questions. What is it that I want to do? What is it that I want to do? What is it what's best for the children in the different planes? You can't, it's very difficult to just give, as you said, like a cookbook, right? There's no recipe because variables are so many. The contexts around the world are so different that what works in one place doesn't work in another place. And what works perfectly and nicely in one place doesn't work in the other.
Exactly.
So that's not the goal of our committee. The goal of our committee is more thought-provoking than other things.
Right. And I think that one of the keys listening to you is thinking about how to keep the child and their developmental needs at the center, because I think I assume most of the people who are here listening today have in some way been involved in this work, and they've worked at a school that has more than one language. And anyone who's done that quickly finds out that you find yourself pushed into maybe considering decisions where you realize that, well, this isn't really in the child's developmental interests. But if the school has committed to this language, and then you get, kind of the pressures and what the families are expecting, what society is expecting, if it's a state requirement. So I think, there are so many questions that come up related to that. So I do think it's great that you all are, putting your knowledge into, onto paper. And so, you will, I'm sure, help many people through some of these questions that they find themselves in their schools as things are evolving. Because it also changes over time, what works in one school in one point in time, situation changes and it doesn't work anymore. So you have to reassess and reevaluate. I mean, it's a very dynamic, ongoing process, as you know. And in terms of, I'm curious to hear, maybe you could say more. I was intrigued when you were saying that how you're trying to look at not just the multilingual part, but the multicultural aspect that goes with that, that's implicit in that. So what are some of your conversations that your group has around the multicultural aspects of this work?
Well, that conversation came up because when you're looking at languages from an aspect of not and, like my language and another language, what that means is that the languages within the classroom come with other things like culture. Like it's not only the language, it's traditions, it's the subtleties of that specific language, it's body language. So many things, it's celebrations, and I mean, just cursing in other languages. You know what I mean? It's not only that, it has to do with the live aspect of the language, which is so important to maintain, and not just to say, well, here we only do this, right? Because that's the multicultural aspect is also who those children are. And it's very rich in the 6 to 12. Multiculturalism is so interesting for the other children. What do you eat in your country? What do you do this? And how do you say this? And how do you say that? And what do you wear? What do people say when this is happening? What are your celebrations? That's everything they want to know.
And within your group, I know from having spoken to you before, I know that some of you also have been doing, reading up on bilingualism, multilingualism in general. So I would be curious to hear how what you're finding kind of in the field as a whole is influencing your perspectives. Is it making a difference, or is it not really making a difference in your conclusions?
I think that as probably it's happening to your working group, as you go deeper and deeper into the conversation, you see how so many other things branch out of this simple topic, which is in your case bilingualism, and in our case it's multilingualism. So sometimes we as a committee have to say that can be part of what we're discussing because it's so vast. And so for us, it has to do more with setting up boundaries within our conversations so that we can really go deeper in what we as a committee have a goal. Because I think we sometimes feel that we're just drifting to other conversations, and then we have to come back and say, let's focus on this first.
Right. So for people who are listening, you can feel free to write questions in the chat that you might want Ana Camila to answer or to give more details. I'm just having a look at some of the questions that are there now, and Some of them are very specific to your particular situation, but I think what's more interesting in terms of having Ana Camila with us today is what you want to know about what she and her fellow trainers are thinking about in terms of this big topic. So if you have any, so one question here, Ana Camila, it says, are you including other voices / research findings in your targeted conversations? If so, how?
Yes, like everybody brings to the table resources they find, and then we don't go through the whole, for example, if we find an article, or if somebody reads a book, or if somebody saw a conversation or maybe a talk, then they bring the outline of it. So basically they bring questions to the conversation. This is what's been said, and how is it for us? How is it in Montessori? Because for us, the focus is Montessori. So it's the theory of multilingualism, but how do you translate that within our specialty, which is Montessori, and a child-centered approach? So yes, we are keeping, like we are reading, and then all the resources that we have consulted will, well, the ones that we consider are appropriate for our committee will be in the document, so that other people can access those resources too. That's basically what we are doing.
Okay. I'm just looking again at the questions in the chat. And as you can imagine, people are trying to relate some of what they're hearing back to their own experience in their classrooms with the children that they're working with. And for example, one question here, which I know is a common one, this is someone who is a native English speaker who has been working in Spain for 20 years. And she is an AMI guide and works with 3 to 4 languages on a daily basis. I do worry about presenting in English to the lower elementary children when they obviously haven't completely understood the concept in math, for example. Isn't another language in this instance more confusing?
We can make a scenario, for example, and I can tell you for my own experience, and for example, my younger daughter, Emiliana, she's right now in a classroom where the lingua franca is English. She has been exposed to the language, but she was in a pre-production stage. So I would speak to her in their classroom. They would speak to her in English. She would understand the instructions and do whatever that was needed, but she wasn't absolutely producing the language. So now she's immersed in a classroom where everything is spoken in English, all of the curricula is given in English, and she's just doing maths in English right now. So sometimes she tells me, for example, Mom, this sign, how do you say it in English? No. Or this sign, or is subtraction this sign, Mom? Yes, Emiliana. So she's just working her way, and I see her sometimes saying out loud the numbers in English and sometimes saying them in Spanish, but she's not at all confused in the process of making an addition or subtraction or reading quantities. Like I say the quantities in English and she can tell them in Spanish, or she can read them in English.
So here's a more general question about longer term outcomes. Do you think AMI trainers will ever get to a point where they add multilingualism adaptations to language albums?
Yeah, so when you take training, you take training in a certain language. For example, I train in Spanish, and the language scheme I deliver is in Spanish. What happens is that sometimes you will, because it's an international diploma, you sometimes end up teaching in a classroom where the lingua franca is not Spanish. So you really don't have the language scheme for another language. So one of the things that is important and that we are developing is you can, or maybe it will come up to a point where you can just get that language scheme for any other language which you already speak, for example, English, or for example, French. Because you can make your own adaptations, because we know how languages function. But there are also subtleties within the language that you don't want to have like a translation approach. Like, for example, I took my training in English, and for many years, what I did was just translate whatever I had in English into Spanish with all the things that I knew already of Spanish, because I am a native Spanish speaker. But there's also other important aspects of working with the materials and developing certain very specific materials for Spanish that are important in the classroom. So yes, I do think that that is something that needs to be developed. It's already done in Spanish, and it's already done for Mandarin. So I guess what the normal development would be is to do that same approach for other languages that are in need.
Here is another question about materials. Will your working group provide a suggested list of material for English as a second language to elementary children?
So when you're doing English as a second language in the classroom, where children are not as exposed to the language as could be in another situation, for example, Mexico. In Mexico, you have exposure to the language because our neighbor is the United States, but the lingua franca everywhere is Spanish. And so what you also have to consider is that a native speaker can, only by hearing, can tell you things that someone who's not a native speaker can't. So for example, when do you use do and when do you use make? That's something a native speaker knows, but it's not something a non-native speaker knows. So those aspects need to be integrated when you are working with like the acquisition of a second language, which is not the same as our language scheme presented in our courses, because we're talking about the native language. So yes, I think that when you are working with a second language acquisition, you need to bring in other aspects that wouldn't be in your albums per se.
Right. Suppose in a way, what the question is that can you envision in 5 years and 10 years that some of that information might be integrated into a training course?
Well, I think it's a difficult question because I don't see it envisioned within the course, because the course has a very specific goal. and a very specific time.
Mhm.
But I can envision it as something that you can acquire later.
So
when
an additional course you could
it
take.
could be either an additional course or a workshop or
Mhm.
something that could come, I think, after.
Mhm.
Because it's very specific to acquiring a language as a second language.
Right.
And that language could be so many different languages.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's not the same acquiring Mandarin as a second language as acquiring English as a second language.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think that, I mean, I've never had this conversation, that specific conversation, but if you ask me in Spanish, no, I don't think I could put that into the course, but yes, of course, for something additional.
Mhm.
Okay.
And again, here's another question about materials, and I'm not sure if this is something that you yourself or the group has really thought about and or worked through, but do you consider that there are language materials in the Montessori sequence that would never really be suitable for second language learners before they have a higher level of fluency in the additional language?
I think that the Montessori language materials are perfect for second language acquisition or your native language. That's what I've seen in my practice. Is that what that person is asking? Like if you can use your materials from your albums?
No, I mean, I think you can use them. I
Mhm.
don't, but I think that some of the materials maybe won't be as interesting to a child who is still in a
As fluent.
of learning the language.
Mhm.
One of the things that has come up in other community conversations is how some guides have found the need to do kind of prior activities before introducing a material, so the children have more vocabulary that they might need so they can really use that material independently. Like the farm, for example.
But again, I think it has to do with the context of the school. If
Mhm.
you're a person who just goes into a classroom for maybe 1 hour a day and you want to use a Montessori material that's on the shelf, I don't think you have the enough exposure for that child to be ready for that material.
Mhm.
Maybe. If you are a person who's there for the whole 6 hours of the day, you'll have much more exposure to just the language, to feel confident with the language, with more vocabulary regarding day-to-day activities, that when you are giving more vocabulary, I think it could get you quicker to all those materials. So I don't think it's just a straight answer, because
No,
it
no,
depends on the context.
right.
What I do think is that our materials can be used in many different ways. And you can use them in different ways, but also using children from different ages and from different abilities regarding language.
Mhm.
And that also helps.
Mhm.
So the material is not only the material you have on the shelf, but also the human resources you have in the classroom. So
Right.
that means not only the adults, because children learn from other children and they get interested because of other children.
Right.
So as you have a group of children who maybe are processing maybe the concept of addition and the other one already has it, you wouldn't give that presentation to that child? Yes, you would. And so I think it also applies to languages or
Mhm.
to language concepts.
Okay, here's a question on a slightly different topic. This is someone who says, I'm writing my thesis on Montessori and Mexican Sign Language and wondering how to integrate Spanish as a second language from a young age, having MSL as the first language. My question is, will a document that you and your team are writing provide useful information about the most appropriate age for integrating Spanish as a second language, primarily using visual materials? Or how can I research more about it?
I think to answer that question, I guess the expert on sign language could have more information about when is it that a child would naturally start another language, if you want to think of it as acquiring a second language, but also how can you adapt whatever you're using in the classroom for children and depending on the age also, because that has to do with the interests of the specific time that they would want to acquire that language. So I would say that it could be a combination of one people's expertise, maybe observing a Montessori classroom and then seeing how those best practices in acquiring a second language could be adapted to these particular children. I think that those best practices would be the same.
Yeah, right.
I don't think they would be different because children are universal. They have the same characteristics. They have the same tendencies. And so that wouldn't be different. It's just the context.
Right.
So asking those questions again and what would be best for them. So I guess the document could work.
But to have whoever wrote that question, we'll be very interested to see what research you discover as you're doing your thesis. I think there could be interesting research out there that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah.
So here's a slightly different question. For countries that are still a bit closed to multilingualism and multiculturalism, will you develop a set of questions to help us develop a program that will help open our children's eyes and stimulate their curiosity?
Like the first thing that comes to my mind is if you want a child to be interested in other languages, there needs to be some kind of exposure to them. Sometimes it's just maybe movies or songs. Songs are a great way of interesting for elementary children. So yes, you could maybe bring those things into the classroom. But I do think that the role of the adult would have to be very specific into bringing that interest into the classroom. How can you do it? That would depend on what's the situation, like the particular situation of where you are.
Right. And I think one thing that I have seen speaking to people in all different places, even in a place that's very monolingual, is that generally in a school community, you still have diversity of cultures and languages. And so I think that one thing that people can do who are in a more, monolingual context is to really look around in the school community and see what other cultural traditions are present, and maybe just not that visible because it's not really, you know, that it's celebrated by the society in general. But I think, I mean, I think there's usually more diversity there than you might realize. That's just my personal feeling. Because as we know, I mean, you know, you know, there's other ways you could introduce things, but it's always more meaningful when it comes from directly from a person themselves, you know. So if I go into an environment and I say, okay, I'm going to make, you know, a Mexican recipe, and it's very, I mean, I'm not Mexican, I don't cook that food, and it's kind of false, and children feel that. But if I invited you to come into the environment and you said, okay, I'm going to make a typical dish that we eat in Mexico all the time, the children engage in a different way, obviously. And so I think it's also about trying to offer authentic experiences of different cultures and languages. So the questions are very diverse. I'm struggling in how to kind of keep a conversational thread going here. That it is jumping around quite a bit. So, I mean, there's requests about the question of 0 to 3 language materials that are sufficient for achieving the desired level of second language vocabulary acquisition. And I don't know what you would say. I would say it's oral language is the main material for that age group, right?
Yes. The adult is the main material for language and oral language. So in that subplane, having an adult all the time is very important. So that the child really gets comfortable with the language and acquiring language vocabulary all the time. So the 3-part cards will give them more as another language lesson, but it's not the main focus.
Right. A specific question, will you provide a suggested list of material for English as a second language for elementary children?
What I had in my environment, we gave English as a second language, was another, next to the Spanish shelf, there was an English shelf with the same materials. So we had all the materials we had in Spanish, we had them in English, with maybe some other materials that the bilingual assistant made because they wanted to deal with very specific things that were happening in how the language was developing, but it was mainly the same. Another classroom that wasn't mine, it was a little bit smaller. So what they did was on the same shelf, they had Spanish and then English at the back. So they would just have both languages in different languages. And then what happened one time is that one of the children said, why do we have Spanish in front? Why don't we have English? And so they just changed it. And so they had English at the front, Spanish at the back. So that's how that other classroom had it. I had 2 shelves, one next to the other. That's how we arranged all the materials. And then obviously there were other materials that were not related just to language. So there were materials that were in the geography shelf and also in the biology shelf. And so it just started diversifying.
Right. Okay, and I think I'll just read one more question and then we'll start wrapping up.
Okay.
Should there be a dedicated English only time with the assistant or specialist? If so, how many hours?
I would say no. My first answer would say no. I would say that the more the better in terms of exposure, and also some children take longer to feel comfortable with the language and to just want to communicate in that language. So the more hours that adult is in the classroom, it really helps. It also helps because they have to deal with day-to-day situations where a child is sad or where a child is, they have a cut. And so they also get involved with the language in very day-to-day activities and situations.
Right.
So I really do think that would be a very important aspect of what, but it also has to do with the goals of your program.
Right. And the resources. If
And the
you
resources and the money, it has to do with many different aspects.
Mhm. Yeah, indeed. And someone else is asking if there's any survey of AMI survey of how many schools have bi or multilingual programs. Not that I'm aware of.
No, not that I know, like a survey per se. I don't know if in the map of AMI has a map with like the schools around the world, but I don't know if there is specific information. I don't know. I would have to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I don't.
Be interesting for the future to add.
Yes.
So people can see that they're really not alone.
Oh no.
Oh
Oh no.
no, but it can feel like it, as you know.
Sure. Yes, it can.
So
Okay, I wrote that down.
so okay, here's one more question and then we'll stop.
Okay.
Do you think that using nonverbal communication, i.e. gestures and signs, together with verbal communication can strengthen the acquisition of a second language? Or not? And it's an interesting question because I do know that there are many guides and also parents who learn this and use gestures and kind of sign language to reinforce. What would be your take on that?
I can tell you in my personal experience, I don't think I didn't say exactly like this gesture means this with children, but verbal, like nonverbal communication just happens all the time when you're acquiring a second language and when you want to communicate something. And children receive that very well.
Yeah.
In 3 to 6, 6 to 12, even in 6 to 12, even in upper elementary, when you're trying to say something and they don't understand and you're just doing mimics and this and that, and another child is saying a word and the other one is jumping in, that really makes it very interesting for them. So I do think that nonverbal communication is very important.
Yeah. And it's because also it's how they let us know what they're understanding too. Okay, well, I think we'll stop there with the questions. Thank you, everyone who took time to write one in, and I'm sorry that we don't have time to get through all of them. But we will continue to do these talks and see what information what things we can answer in other ways. And so for now, I want to thank Ana Camila for taking this time and for explaining to everyone what this committee is doing, and kind of what you're not doing, because I think sometimes when people hear that it exists, they think that you're gonna come out with the magic curriculum and will show everyone how to teach a second language in a Montessori environment. So I think it's important for people to understand that isn't one of the objectives. Just like with our work, it's our objective is to help people ask questions and to help give them examples of things that work in different places and why, to give inspiration, basically. So I think both of our groups are very much aligned in that sense.
Yes.
So thank you all for coming. I think we're going to do one more Menti now. These are all interesting questions. And I think Ana Camila did say that they will be including best practices, as will we in our own work. So you will have more and more examples available to you. And yeah, a couple of people are asking about contacting the committee, but I think since you're all volunteers, I'm not sure that there's a central place that people can get in touch. Is there, Ana Camila?
Yeah, it's my email. I'm the one.
Okay.
I'm the one. I'll write it on the chat.
Okay, great.
Anyone can contact me there.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All for giving us these additional questions, and I'm sure Ana Camila will take them back to her committee. And most of us from my group are here today, but we will certainly discuss some of these questions. We have meetings coming up starting tomorrow, to keep advancing our own work. So we'll definitely keep in mind some of the things that you've put forward. And as always, when we send out our newsletters, I always invite you to write to us either with questions, or if you have experiences that you want to share, successes that you've had in your own school, things that you've learned along the way. I mean, that's part of what our work is collecting experiences from all of you and making them available to a more general audience. So, please don't feel shy about writing and getting in touch. And for Ana Camila will share her email in the chat. And if you have specific questions for the committee, I'm sure she'll do her best to answer you.
Yes.
So thank you again, Ana Camila, for taking this time.
Mary, for inviting me and all the committee.
No, this has been really wonderful. And and thank you everyone for coming. As we said, the next talk will be in a few weeks, in November. Here's the November 8th, November 22nd, January 13th, February 21st. And from there, there'll be more or less one per month. So a different rhythm than earlier. But hopefully equally interesting topics for all of you. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and I wish you all a good day, a good evening, depending on where you are, a good night, perhaps. And we look forward to seeing you in the next talk. Thank you all for coming.